Hi guys, tonight we begin with something that might sound grand and glittering, but once you pull the curtains back, it's actually cold and frightening. You're standing in a medieval church, its stones damp with centuries of winter rain, its walls echoing with the faint scrape of boots and the flicker of torchlight. You smell the beeswax from candles, sharp and sweet, but that sweetness doesn't calm you. The air feels heavy, pressing on your chest. Everyone is watching, and you know in your bones that you probably won't survive this the way a modern bride survives a wedding day with laughter, champagne, and a cheeky honeymoon selfie. No, here the stakes are far higher, and the fears much heavier. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and your local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, because you're about to find yourself walking through a story where wedding bells toll more like funeral chimes. You stand in that church and your hands tremble. The nave stretches long, shadows clinging in the rafters like watchful spirits. Your footsteps sound too loud on the flagstones, and your mind drifts to what you've been told. This is the holiest day of your life. But if it's so holy, why does it feel like you're being marched into something you can't escape? That's the cruel irony. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't just about love, it was a binding contract, watched over not just by your family, but by God Himself. And unlike today's paperwork, you don't get an annulment unless someone dies or the Pope himself decides you deserve mercy. One undeniable fact historians remind us of is that churches of the era were intentionally intimidating. Their size, their echoes, their stained glass, all of it designed to make you feel small before God. A wedding wasn't some cozy backyard party. It was staged in a space that whispered of eternity, salvation, and damnation. As you shuffle forward, your eyes are drawn upward, to the cold arches overhead, as if heaven itself is bearing down, demanding obedience. And yet, here's a curious little detail. Villagers often crashed weddings, not to politely clap, but to gossip, drink, and sometimes even fight. The churchyard could become rowdy, and in some places, weddings felt more like chaotic carnivals than solemn ceremonies. Imagine trying to whisper your vows while a drunk cousin stumbles into the aisle, or worse, when local youths pound on the doors, demanding their chance at free food. That's the backdrop to your sacred promises. But what gnaws deeper than the noise is the idea that you might be trapped forever. Scholars still debate whether medieval brides themselves truly grasped the permanence of their vows, or whether it was more the elders, the parents, priests, and lords who carried the weight of that knowledge. Some argue brides were little more than pawns, shuffled from one family's chessboard to another. Others suggest women felt the enormity personally, trembling at the altar because they knew this was no rehearsal. Once those words left your lips, they bound you until death. And death wasn't a far-off idea. It lingered around every birth, every fever, every cut that festered. You try to focus on the priest's words, but instead you hear the whispers of villagers behind you. Someone coughs, another stifles a laugh, and your stomach twists. You can't help noticing how the smoke of the candles blurs the air, how the wax drips like slow tears. The scent is cloying, almost suffocating. Is it your imagination, or does it feel as though you're being swallowed alive by ritual? You grip the rough fabric of your gown, but it doesn't steady you. Your palms sweat, your knees weaken, and the stone beneath you feels cold as ice. You glance at your groom, perhaps older, perhaps a stranger, and you can't read his face. He's as rigid as the pillars. You wonder, does he feel this terror too? Or is this just your lot as the bride, your body and soul on the line, while he merely repeats words by rote? Remember, this is not just a wedding. It's an exchange of property, of alliances, of wealth and name. The atmosphere isn't filled with confetti but with calculation. Every cough, every shift of weight from the congregation echoes like a reminder. They are here to witness not joy but duty. And still there's a part of you that notices the beauty just a sliver. The way the light pierces through coloured glass, scattering reds and blues across the stone. For a moment, you almost feel lifted, almost believe the talk of grace. But then another candle sputters, smoke curling toward your eyes, and the sting brings you back to the reality that this beauty isn't for you. It's for God, and for the church, and for your family's honor. You close your eyes, wishing you could disappear into the hymn swelling from the choir. Their voices rise like a tide, and you can feel the vibrations in your chest. It should comfort you, but instead it feels like the tide is pulling you under. You clutch the candle in your hand tighter, your fingers whitening. That trembling flame mirrors your heart shaking, flickering but forced to stay upright. In this first moment, standing at the threshold of vows, you're not the radiant heroine of a fairy tale. You're a young woman balancing between obedience and fear, between hope and dread, in a space that smells of incense and damp earth. And though the songs speak of blessing, your body whispers a truth you can't ignore. This is as much a trial as it is a celebration. You don't have time to catch your breath before the weight of how you got here crashes down on you. This wasn't your choice. Not really. You never strolled into a tavern, locked eyes with your beloved, and declared eternal love. Instead, you were bartered, positioned, traded like fine wool, like a prize cow, like a carefully measured sack of grain. That's how most marriages unfolded in the Middle Ages. Parents arranged, elders bargained, and the bride herself stood like an object at the center of negotiation. You can picture the moment when it was all decided. Two fathers leaning across a table, voices hushed, hands clasped around tankards of ale. A priest, perhaps, hovering in the corner, nodding approval. No one turned to you, asked your opinion, or bothered to see if you even liked the man whose hand you're now clutching. To them, your feelings didn't rank. What mattered was land, coin, livestock, and the strengthening of family ties. A mainstream fact sits heavy here. In most medieval communities, daughters were married off not in their late 20s after years of adventure, but much younger, sometimes barely into their teens. The average noble girl might be pledged before her body even matured. The reasoning was blunt: marry her early, secure her loyalty, and ensure heirs as soon as possible. The colder side of this truth makes your stomach twist. But alongside this, here's a peculiar little tidbit. Some families added odd extras to the marriage contract, like a goat that could not be sold, or a promise that the groom's family must keep the bride's favorite maid employed for life. These tiny clauses, so strange, so human, make you almost smile, though it doesn't soften the fear. They remind you that even in a world of hard bargains, people slipped in eccentric details to keep a shred of control, and scholars remain divided on how much say a bride could sneak into the process. Some argue that noble women occasionally had leverage if they came with enormous dowries, if they were heiresses, if their fathers happened to be pliable. Others suggest that was rare, and most women had little more than the power of tears or silence. Did those tears sway decisions, or were they simply ignored, brushed aside like spilled ale on a table? No one agrees fully. You shuffle in your seat, because imagining yourself as a commodity makes your skin crawl. Think of how uncomfortable it would be if someone described you aloud. One fertile girl, of good family, expected to bring 20 silver coins, a chest of linen, and a cow. The line between your humanity and your market value blurs uncomfortably. That is what frightens you most. Not just the vows, not just the church, but the realization that you're here because of a deal. And when you glance sideways at your new husband, you wonder, does he see you as a wife, or as a ledger entry finally fulfilled? His jaw is set, his expression unreadable. Maybe he's as trapped as you are, bound by promises his father arranged, unable to rebel. That thought is almost comforting, the idea that you're both pawns, not master and servant. But then again, only one of you risks death in childbirth. Only one of you loses a family name. Your ears catch a whisper behind you. A villager mutters about the dowry, whether your father overpaid or underpaid. Another whispers about the harvest, and whether your union will bring luck. It's unsettling how much everyone ties your fate to the turning of soil, and the clink of coins. It's not just love, or rather, it's not love at all. It's survival. The candles flicker again, and you press your hands together to still their shaking. You're aware that behind every smile from your relatives lies calculation. They don't beam because you're happy. They beam because a deal is sealed. Your parents' eyes shine with relief. The bargain is done. Their daughter placed. Their obligations met. You let your thoughts drift back further, to those tense evenings when marriage was first mentioned in your household. Perhaps your mother gave you a warning glance, a silent reminder not to object. Perhaps your father cleared his throat and told you sternly that this was for the good of the family. You wanted to protest, but your words caught in your throat. The fire popped in the hearth, and in that moment you realized your life was no longer your own. The bitterness of that realization still lingers on your tongue now, standing here in church, and with it comes another pang. You may never again sit by that hearth. You've been bargained away, and in the eyes of law and faith, you belong elsewhere now. The crackling warmth of your old life fades, replaced with the chill of stone. You tighten your grip on the candle again, because the reality of bargaining weighs more than the stone pillars. The truth echoes. You were traded, and in that echo lies the deepest fear that your worth, however great your heart, was decided not by who you are, but by what you could bring. You stand there, heart pounding, and you can almost feel the weight of your dowry pressing down on your shoulders. It's not just metaphorical, it's as if every coin, every bolt of cloth, every cow promised in the contract sits stacked invisibly on your back. You aren't just a bride, you're the vessel that carries wealth from one family to another. Your body may wear white, but your worth is measured in silver, wool, and land. One thing historians agree on is that the dowry was the engine of marriage in much of medieval Europe. Without it, you might not have found a husband at all. The exchange wasn't about hearts, it was about economics. Your dowry might secure farmland, repair debts, or expand trade. For nobles, it might even buy soldiers for a campaign. You are, in effect, a walking purse with a pulse. That's a harsh truth to swallow as you stand trembling under the vaulted roof. And yet, hidden in the records, you stumble across the oddest little quirks. Some dowries didn't just include coin or cattle. They included items that sound almost comical now. There are cases of brides bringing geese, barrels of ale, or even beds of onions as part of their contribution. Imagine showing up to your wedding, dragging not only a chest of linen but also a gaggle of honking geese tethered at your skirts. It sounds ridiculous, almost cartoonish. But for families scraping survival, those geese meant food, feathers, and trade. But here's where scholars diverge. Some argue that dowries gave women a strange kind of power, because technically, in many regions, the dowry remained hers. If she were widowed, she might claim it back, a thin financial lifeline in a brutal world. Others point out that once a woman was married, her husband usually managed everything, dowry included, leaving her little control. The debate lingers. Did the dowry empower, or did it enslave? The answer, like so much of history, seems to depend on the woman, the family, and the fortune of her fate. You close your eyes and imagine the whispers around you now. The villagers know what you've brought. They gossip about the value, some saying your family paid too much, others muttering it wasn't enough. You picture your father's tense expression when the bargaining dragged on late into the night, the sharp scrape of quills across parchment as numbers and items were listed like an inventory. Your own worth written in ink sealed with wax. You've been transformed into an account book with legs. It's a suffocating thought, and yet part of you clings to the tiniest ember of hope. Maybe your dowry will protect you. Maybe, just maybe, your new husband will treat you with respect, not out of affection, but out of fear of angering your family and losing the wealth you carried in. That faint glimmer doesn't soothe the shaking in your hands, but it's something. The priest's voice echoes in the stone nave, but you hear only fragments. Instead, you find yourself picturing the objects that supposedly define you, the chest of linen folded neatly by your mother's hands, the coins that glinted in torchlight as they were weighed, the animals lowing outside in the yard. You smell hay, leather, and the faint tang of iron coins. They are all parts of you now, stitched into your identity. You wonder if your husband thinks of it too. Is he looking at you, or at the imagined chest of silver standing invisibly by your side? Does he see your face, or just the cattle grazing on the land your dowry purchased? You feel small again, smaller than the soaring church arches above you, smaller than the candle flame trembling in your hand. A sudden draught rustles through the church, flickering the candles, and the shadows on the walls seem to move. It almost feels like the stones themselves lean in to remind you. You are part of a transaction, one that cannot be undone. The fear doesn't come only from the ritual or the vows, it comes from knowing that your value has been calculated down to the last coin, and that this calculation will follow you for the rest of your married life. And yet, if you tilt your head a certain way, you notice another truth. Those same dowries, absurd as they seem, tied families together. They were a hedge against famine, a bridge between feuding neighbors, sometimes even a way for women to bring a piece of their own world with them. That chest of linen? It's your mother's work, her hands folded into every thread. That goose? It's the sound of your old farmyard, waddling awkwardly into your new life. You carry not only wealth, but echoes of the place you once called home. Still, the fear doesn't vanish. You clutch the candle tighter, as though its small flame could burn away the invisible weight of silver and geese alike. But the truth remains. Tonight, as you stand trembling in a church that smells of stone and smoke, you're more than a bride. You're a balance sheet brought to life. You feel the sting in your chest before the moment even comes. It isn't just about coins or contracts anymore. It's the knowledge that after today, you may never again sleep under the same roof as your parents. Never again smell the smoke of your own hearth, or hear the familiar creak of the floorboards where you once played as a child. A medieval marriage wasn't simply a union, it was an uprooting. Once the vows were spoken, you didn't return home except perhaps for rare visits. You were leaving, and the finality gnaws at you like a stone in your shoe. The historical record makes it plain. Marriage meant the bride shifted households permanently. She belonged to her husband's family now, her loyalty transferred like a flag raised over conquered ground. For many, it was the first time they left their village for good, their ties severed not just physically but legally. A fact repeated in court rolls and church records is that once married, a woman no longer had rights in her father's household. She became, in every sense, a stranger there. And yet, tucked into folklore, there are odd little stories that make you pause. Some brides clung desperately to symbolic farewells, nibbling a piece of bread from their family table one last time, or tying a lock of hair to a tree near the village gate, as if leaving a fragment of themselves behind. It sounds superstitious, even quaint, but it speaks volumes about how terrifying it was to cut the cord completely. Imagine walking away with nothing but memories, leaving behind the smell of your mother's stew, the sound of your younger siblings laughing, and replacing it all with silence in a foreign hall. Scholars remain split on whether this wrenching loss was softened by excitement. Some argue that young women, especially those from poor families, might have felt relief at the prospect of food security and a sturdier roof. Others insist that the fear outweighed everything else, that the pain of exile burned longer than any benefit. Did brides walk with heads held high, or with tears streaking down their cheeks? The truth is probably both, depending on whose story you follow. But you standing here in the church feel the tears pressing at the back of your eyes. You picture your mother's face in the dim candlelight. She doesn't smile. Not really. She's proud, perhaps, but she knows what it means too. You won't sit beside her at the spinning wheel tomorrow, won't fetch water with her from the well. She's losing you as much as you're losing her. That thought makes the stone beneath your feet seem even colder. You let your mind wander to the hearth at home, the crackle of kindling, the thick smell of smoke in your hair, the way your father always poked at the fire with the same iron rod. You can hear it, see it, almost feel the warmth brushing your cheeks, and then you blink, and it's gone. replaced by candle smoke and Latin prayers. The contrast hits like a slap. Someone coughs behind you, and you realize the entire congregation knows this is farewell. It isn't just you and your parents who feel it. Your siblings, your neighbors, the village children, they all understand that you are no longer one of them. You are being transferred, like a relic carried solemnly from one shrine to another. And if you falter in your new life, you can't just run home. The door of your childhood will be barred. Your fingers tremble as you clutch your gown. You wonder if you'll ever hear your younger brother call your name again, or if he'll grow up seeing you only as a distant memory, a sister who vanished into another household. That ache burns deeper than the vows themselves. The priest's chant echoes around you, but you're caught in the silence between words. You imagine yourself tomorrow, waking in a strange bed, eating from unfamiliar bowls, listening to voices you barely know. The thought makes your stomach twist. And yet, perhaps you find a shred of strength in the idea that countless others have endured this before you. Some thrived, some faded, but all walked this same aisle with the same tightness in their throat. You are part of a long line of daughters carried away by duty. Still, the image won't leave you. Your parents watching you step out of the church, knowing in their hearts this is goodbye. They may live a mile away or 50, but either way, you are gone. That's why brides trembled not only at the vows, not only at the contracts, but at the echoing finality of leaving home forever. The thought of leaving home forever still lingers when another anxiety creeps into your chest. The unknown walls you must now inhabit. You picture yourself stepping into a house that smells different, sounds different, feels different in every corner. The hearth will burn wood of another forest. The floors creak in rhythms you don't know. The voices around the table will speak with tones that don't yet feel like family. You're no longer a daughter in a familiar nest. You're the outsider in someone else's household. One solid fact rings true across medieval Europe. Marriage almost always meant the bride moved into the husband's family home, not the other way around. You weren't building a new household from scratch. You were dropped into an established one, with its pecking orders, grudges, and unspoken rules. The groom's parents might still hold authority, especially the mother-in-law, who often became both overseer and critic. You might wake tomorrow under her stern gaze, realizing you must learn every rule of this place without offending anyone. And here's one of those curious little tidbits that makes the picture even stranger. In some regions, it was custom to lead the bride straight into the kitchen upon arrival, not to rest, not to toast with wine, but to test her ability to stir a pot, salt a dish, or bake bread. Imagine the horror after hours of ritual, veils, vows, and tears. You're handed a ladle and expected to prove you can season stew for strangers. If you burn it, the whispers would follow you for years. Historians don't fully agree on how harsh these transitions were. Some insist that in smaller villages, brides were gently welcomed, folded into their husband's kin with warmth, especially if both families already knew one another. Others suggest the opposite, that brides endured cold scrutiny, sometimes humiliation, until they proved their worth. Did a new bride feel supported, or did she feel like a servant walking into someone else's hall? The debate continues, and perhaps the truth lives somewhere in the uneasy middle. But you don't need scholars to tell you what you feel in your bones right now. The idea of walking through a doorway that isn't yours, setting down your chest of linen in a room that smells of unfamiliar hay, listening to strange footsteps at night, that thought alone makes your skin prickle. Every sound will feel suspicious, every corner unfriendly. Even the hearth, supposed to warm you, might seem to glare with sparks like watchful eyes. You glance sideways at your groom again, wondering, will he stand beside you tomorrow, guide you through these rooms, defend you when his mother scolds? Or will he vanish into fields and councils, leaving you to navigate the cold stairs alone? The uncertainty twists your stomach. You're not just marrying a man, you're marrying an entire household, an entire hierarchy, and you're entering it from the lowest rung. The flicker of torches in the church walls brings the thought alive in your mind. You imagine doors creaking open, rooms filled with whispers, the crunch of straw underfoot. You imagine laughter that stops when you enter, spoons clattering when you sit down. Even the dogs might bark as though you don't belong. Still, there's a faint glimmer tucked away in this dread. New households sometimes offered opportunities a chance to rise, to build influence if you navigated carefully, to win trust. A clever bride might use her skills in spinning, cooking, or even storytelling to weave herself into the fabric of the house. That tiny chance at control shimmers faintly, though the fear of rejection presses harder. Your candle trembles in your hand, the wax pooling dangerously close to your skin. You know you will soon walk out of this stone church and into another set of walls entirely. And in that moment, the fear of strange floors and foreign fires feels just as sharp as the fear of vows themselves. The voices in the nave fade for a moment, and then the priest's words slice through the haze like a blade. His tone is solemn, almost booming in the stone cavern of the church. And you realize he isn't just officiating, he's warning. Every sentence falls like a nail hammered into wood. This isn't a blessing, it's a contract. The vows don't sound like promises of love, they sound like sentences of judgment. You repeat after him because you must, your tongue dry, your voice barely above a whisper, while he reminds you of eternity. Here's the stark truth. In the medieval world, marriage was a sacrament. Once spoken, the vows were binding in the eyes of God and law. Divorce, as you know it today, wasn't an option. At best, there might be an annulment if the union hadn't been consummated, or if blood ties were discovered. But those loopholes were rare, often political, and almost never granted to ordinary people. For most brides, once the words left their lips, there was no going back. That finality pressed into your chest like a millstone. And yet, strange little rituals sometimes crept into the process. In a few regions, couples were told to stand barefoot on the cold church floor, a symbolic reminder that marriage was about humility and hardship. Others were instructed to clasp hands over a Bible, or to drink from the same chalice. These gestures look quaint now, but in the moment, they reinforced the terrifying reality you were stepping into something unbreakable. Scholars still argue about how much fear priests deliberately cultivated in brides. Some historians claim priests emphasized the sacrament as joyful, holy, and uplifting, reminding couples that they were part of God's plan. Others suggest the tone was often stern, even threatening, laced with reminders of damnation if vows were broken. Did brides hear promises of blessing, or did they hear chains rattling into place? No consensus exists, and perhaps both were true depending on the priest, the parish, and the bride's own ears. But you, standing here, feel the threat more than the blessing. The echo of the priest's voice reverberates off the stone until it vibrates in your skull. He speaks of sin, of obedience, of eternal duty. You can almost hear the rustle of parchment where angels supposedly record your promises. The thought that heaven itself is taking notes makes your stomach tighten further. You glance at your groom. His lips move firmly, clearly, repeating each vow with confidence. You, on the other hand, stumble on the words, your voice catching in your throat. For a heartbeat, you think the priest glares, and you imagine the villagers watching, judging whether you said the words loudly enough, sincerely enough. If you falter, will they say you cursed the marriage before it began? The pressure swells until you feel your knees wobble. Your mind flashes to whispered stories you've overheard from older women. A bride who spoke too softly and was said to have brought misfortune on her union. Another who slipped on the stone floor during vows, an omen of widowhood. These tales crowd your head as you force yourself to stand tall, even as your hands sweat against the wax taper. The smell of incense thickens, clinging to your throat. You cough softly, but the priest barrels onward, pressing you into promises of obedience. Each phrase feels less like a celebration and more like a contract carved in stone. Your heart thuds in your chest. This isn't a moment of joy, it's a binding oath, one you can't undo without scandal, shame, or the grave. And yet, even as dread curls around you, a small thought flickers. If you can endure this moment, perhaps you can endure the rest. If your voice doesn't fail, if your knees don't buckle, you might survive the weight of words and walk into the unknown with at least the satisfaction of having stood your ground. That flicker of defiance glows faintly against the chill of the priest's tone. Still, when the final vow leaves your lips, you feel it settle not in your heart but in your bones, heavy and immovable. The priest lifts his hand, pronounces blessing, and the villagers murmur approval. But all you can feel is the echo like the closing of a door that will never open again. The vows may be spoken, but your stomach still churns. Because in this age, words alone don't safeguard a wedding day. You've been told since childhood that demons lurk in shadows, witches slip curses into the cracks of stone, and envious neighbors can ruin a bride with nothing more than a muttered spell. The church might bless you, but the countryside still believes in things that creep, hiss, and meddle. One firm fact of the medieval world is that superstition threaded itself through every stage of life, and weddings were no exception. Priests might thunder about holy sacraments, but villagers whispered about omens. If a dog barked during the vows, if a crow circled overhead, if the candle sputtered too violently, it was taken as a sign of disaster. A bride might glance nervously at the rafters, searching for bats, terrified they'd swoop and doom her union before it began. And here's a quirky little tidbit to curl your lips. In certain places, brides tucked garlic into their shoes to ward off evil spirits. Imagine shuffling down the aisle with cloves pressing into your heels, your gown swaying gently, all while villagers nod approvingly at the faint smell of stew drifting up from your skirts. Garlic wasn't the only charm. Either some pinned herbs into their veils, others hid iron nails in their pockets. It must have looked ridiculous, but in the anxious world of superstition, it was deadly serious. Of course, historians don't always agree on how much weight brides themselves gave these beliefs. Some argue that most women were deeply convinced, terrified that one wrong step could unleash ruin. Others suggest that superstition was often a communal game, encouraged by neighbors and gossips more than by the brides themselves. Was the garlic a true shield against evil, or just a village tradition no one dared break? The answer still wavers in dusty manuscripts and folklore scraps. But you can feel it now, the unease in the church, the prickling at the back of your neck as you glance at the dark corners where shadows crouch. What if someone in the crowd wishes you ill? What if your dowry sparked envy, and a muttered curse drifts toward you like smoke? You clutch your candle harder, its flame your only fragile defense against the unseen. The choir's hymn rises again, but you notice a woman in the crowd crossing herself 3 times instead of once, her lips moving quickly as though warding off something near you. It sends a jolt up your spine. Even the villagers, pious as they appear, can't stop themselves from fearing the old spirits. Your mind drifts to the stories you heard by the hearth. Brides cursed to barren wombs, grooms struck dead before the year was out, houses haunted by spiteful sprites because someone forgot to sprinkle salt on the threshold. These tales swirl with the smoke of incense until you can almost see shapes in the air. Claws, eyes, whispers just out of reach. A sudden pop from a candle makes you jump, your heart racing. You hear a muffled laugh behind you, but you don't dare look. What if they noticed your fear? What if laughing at it makes it real? The sound echoes in your skull, blending with the priest's Latin, with the rustle of cloaks, with the scrape of boots on stone. And still, you keep walking forward, because what else can you do? You try to calm yourself with the thought that countless brides before you survived these same whispers and shadows. You remind yourself that maybe the garlic really works. Maybe the prayers drown out the envy. Maybe the iron nail stitched into your hem glints, unseen but powerful. Yet when you close your eyes, you can't shake the image of dark figures crouched just beyond the candlelight, waiting. This is why brides trembled not only because of priests and parents, but because in a world thick with superstition, even the air itself felt dangerous. And tonight, you breathe it in with every step. You try to steady your breath, but another kind of dread slithers into your thoughts, one that doesn't come from shadows or demons but from people themselves. You've heard the whispers, the cruel stories traded among women while spinning wool or drawing water, a bride who failed the so-called virginity test, the humiliation of it, the way her in-laws sneered, The way the village mocked lingers in your mind like smoke that won't disperse. The fact is hard to escape. Medieval society placed an obsessive emphasis on a bride's chastity. For noble families, especially, a bride's virginity was not only a moral matter but a financial one. If you were discovered not to be pure, your dowry could be contested, your marriage annulled, and your family dishonored. The pressure was immense, and women carried it like a noose around their necks. And yet, here's an unsettling, almost absurd tidbit. In some towns after the wedding night, relatives and servants literally inspected the sheets for bloodstains as proof of virginity. If the evidence wasn't there, gossip swirled like hornets, and excuses were demanded. Some clever brides supposedly smuggled in drops of animal blood or pricked their fingers to fake the sign. Imagine the terror on top of everything else. You had to plan for stagecraft in the most private corner of your life. Historians still dispute just how widespread these practices were. Some argue they were exaggerated, more rumor than reality, mentioned in chronicles to shame women rather than reflect common practice. Others point to surviving legal cases and folk customs that suggest it happened more often than we'd like to believe. Was every bed scrutinized, or only those of high-born brides where wealth and alliances were at stake? The debate is ongoing, and in the flicker of these candles, you feel trapped in that uncertainty. The thought gnaws at you as you glance at your groom. Does he wonder too? Will his family press him for proof tomorrow? Will they measure your worth by stains instead of by your voice, your skills, your humanity? You feel heat rise in your cheeks, though not from desire. It's the raw shame of being judged by something so far beyond your control. You try to focus on the voices around you, but the gossip presses louder in your head. You hear the laughter of maids in your imagination, whispering in corners, retelling your wedding night as though it were a public spectacle. Your candle shakes in your hand, wax dripping hot on your fingers. You don't flinch, you can't let them see your nerves, but the pain anchors the fear even deeper. The church smells suddenly harsher incense, sweat, wool, and beneath it all, the faint odor of damp stone. The sensory assault mixes with your dread, and for a moment you feel dizzy. You picture tomorrow, a room with too many ears pressed to doors, your body not your own, your reputation dangling on a knife's edge. And yet, if you search the haze, there is one fragile consolation. Sometimes, those same rituals were quietly mocked. In bawdy songs and tavern tales, villagers laughed at the absurdity of elders crowding around a bedchamber door, at the clumsy faking of proof. Perhaps humor was the only way to cope with a system so cruel. It doesn't erase your fear, but it reminds you that even then, people recognized the absurdity. Still, as the hymn rises again, you can't laugh. The sound seems heavy now, thick with judgment. You glance down at your trembling hands and realize that what terrifies you most isn't the priest, or the demons, or even the strange household waiting outside these walls. It's the knowledge that tonight your body will be treated as evidence. And evidence, you know, can be twisted against you. Your candle quivers in your hand, and for a moment you're certain it isn't just nerves, it's the crushing weight of what you're wearing. The gown that was meant to honor you, to display your family's wealth and pride, now feels more like a prison of fabric, layers of wool, silk if you're lucky. Heavy embroidery stitched with gold or silver thread, it drags on your shoulders, tugs at your breath, and scrapes against your skin. Every step you take feels as though you're walking in chains disguised as beauty. One undeniable fact is that bridal clothing in the Middle Ages was often a family's chance to flaunt status. White wasn't yet the standard. Instead, brides wore their best deep reds, greens, blues, sometimes trimmed with fur if they could afford it. But all that finery came at a cost. Weight. Some gowns were so layered and stiff with embroidery that moving gracefully became a trial. It was a silent test of endurance, endured beneath the gaze of the entire congregation. And here's the quirky detail that almost makes you smile through the sweat. In some regions, brides were expected to borrow jewelry from neighbors, draping themselves like glittering treasure chests. The logic was that borrowed trinkets spread luck across the community. But for the bride, It meant being loaded down with bangles, chains, and rings until she jangled like a walking bell tower. Beautiful? Perhaps. Comfortable? Absolutely not. Historians still disagree on how willingly women embraced this ordeal. Some argue that the weight of the clothing was worn proudly, a physical signal of prosperity that reassured both families. Others suggest it was dreaded, endured only because to complain would seem ungrateful or disrespectful. Was the heavy gown a crown or a curse? The record can't quite decide. But in your body, in this moment, you know exactly how it feels. The fabric scratches against your arms where sweat makes it cling. The brocade collar presses against your throat, making every swallow ache. The belt of metal links digs into your waist like a chain, reminding you that your movements aren't entirely your own anymore. The candles may flicker, the choir may sing, but you feel trapped inside your own attire. You glance down at your shoes, narrow, stiff, pinching at the toes. They gleam from fresh polish, but inside your skin rubs raw, threatening blisters. You try to adjust your stance without drawing attention, but the layers of skirt resist, pulling you back into awkward stiffness. Every nerve in your body whispers that if you trip, if you stumble, all eyes will remember it forever. A bead of sweat rolls down your neck, caught beneath the embroidery. You imagine villagers whispering, "She looked pale, she looked weak," and the fear grows sharper. The gown is supposed to make you radiant, but instead it makes you anxious, overheating under torchlight, pinned into a version of yourself designed for display rather than comfort. Still, you notice something else in the corner of your mind. Those same threads, the embroidery stitched into the fabric, carry your mother's handiwork. Every tiny knot is a reminder of her labor, her love disguised as ornament. You remember the late nights she worked by lamplight, her fingers raw from needle pricks, weaving prayers into the seams. That thought steadies you for a moment. Beneath the suffocating layers, you carry her. The priest's words drone on, and you try to shift your shoulders, but the weight remains. You feel like a statue being unveiled, gleaming and lifeless at the same time. The congregation stares. Your husband stands steady beside you, and your lungs fight against the grip of fabric. You wonder, fleetingly, if this is how queens felt on their coronation days, draped in glory that felt more like a yoke. And as you force yourself to hold still, you realize this too is part of the fear. You're not only leaving home, not only entering a strange household, not only battling omens and vows, you're also suffocating under the very symbols of wealth that were supposed to protect you. The gown gleams, but it shackles. The jewels sparkle, but they bruise. Tonight, beauty itself becomes another form of burden. The weight of the gown is already unbearable, but now another ritual threatens to squeeze the breath from your lungs. You feel hands tugging, pulling, cinching at your waist, as though they're trying to mold your body into something smaller, tighter, more obedient. You're being laced into girdles, cords, or bodices that dig into your ribs and press against your stomach, forcing you into a posture that screams submission. Beauty, here, is not about comfort, it's about control. The historical record shows that brides, especially among the wealthier classes, were often bound into layers that reshaped their bodies. Even before corsets as we know them, medieval garments included belts, girdles, and fastenings meant to emphasize the waist and constrain movement. It was as though the clothing itself reminded the bride of her new role, restrained, contained, and held firmly in place. To be cinched was to be shaped for obedience. And there's a curious tidbit that almost makes you snort despite the pressure on your ribs. In some places, it was customary to lace brides so tightly that they fainted during the ceremony. This wasn't taken as a bad sign, it was treated as proof of delicate virtue, a swooning flower ready to be carried off. Imagine trying to mutter vows while your vision blurs and your lungs scream for air, and the crowd whispers approvingly, "Ah, how maidenly." But surviving evidence doesn't quite agree on how universal this practice was. Some chronicles hint that it was widespread among elites, especially where clothing signaled wealth and refinement. Other sources suggest fainting brides were more legend than common event. exaggerated in poems and tales to highlight female fragility. Which was it, an everyday expectation, or a story spun to entertain? The sources don't line up neatly, leaving us to hover in uncertainty. You, however, don't need scholars to tell you how it feels. The cords bite into your skin. Every shallow breath rasps against the edge of cloth that feels more like a shackle. Your chest rises only halfway before fabric presses it back down. Sweat trickles under the layers, and the pressure makes your heart pound harder. You fear that if you stumble, you won't have the breath to call for help. A murmur of admiration ripples through the crowd. But you know it isn't for your spirit, it's for the shape your body takes under strain. They see an obedient bride, a figure molded to match their expectations. You feel instead like a bird crammed into a cage, wings folded so tightly they might break. And yet, hidden inside the discomfort, there's another angle. The girdle or belt wasn't only a restraint, it was often adorned with charms. Some were etched with prayers, tiny crosses, or protective inscriptions, meant to guard a bride's fertility or ward off ill fortune. In a strange way, the very cords that squeezed you might also have been thought of as talismans of safety. It's almost comical, an instrument of control doubling as a source of supposed protection. Still, when the priest's voice rises again, and the incense thickens, you can't find comfort in that. Your ribs ache, your vision swims, and the room tilts ever so slightly. You lock your knees to keep yourself upright, forcing your lips into the faintest imitation of serenity. To faint here, before the vows are finished, would be to hand the gossipers a feast they'd dine on for years. You glance down, noticing the candle trembling in your bound hands. The flame wavers wildly, as though it mirrors your shallow, unsteady breath. For a moment, you wonder whether the entire ceremony is less about blessing and more about breaking your will, breaking your body, shaping you into someone pliant enough to endure whatever comes next. That thought lodges itself deep as you inhale against the crushing fabric, wishing desperately that you could breathe freely again. But no matter how the crowd admires your laced figure, you know the truth. This tightness is fear woven into cloth. The cords still bite into your ribs when you hear the faint snip of scissors, and suddenly another ritual comes to mind, one just as unsettling, though quieter. A strand of your hair, sometimes just a lock, sometimes far more, is taken away, cut deliberately as a symbol. It isn't about style. It's about stripping a piece of you, showing that who you were before this moment no longer belongs to you. Medieval records remind us that hair often carried deep symbolism. A maiden's hair, long and unbound, represented youth, freedom, and virginity. Cutting it, or binding it beneath a veil, marked the end of that chapter and the start of submission to a husband. In convents, novices shaved their heads as a sign of devotion. In marriage, a bride might lose a piece of herself in quieter, but no less permanent, fashion. And then there's the odd little detail tucked into some traditions. In parts of Europe, that cut hair was sometimes buried beneath the threshold of the new household. The belief was that it tied the bride spiritually to her husband's home, making sure she would never stray. Imagine the eerie thought of your own hair, once brushed by your mother's hand, now tucked into dirt like a root binding you to strange soil. But sources don't quite line up on how common the snipping truly was. Some scholars argue it lingered more in poetic descriptions and courtly tales than in widespread practice. Others point to church records and household notes that mention hair rituals plainly. Was every bride shorn in some way, or only those in specific regions? The evidence scatters, leaving us with fragments instead of certainty. Still, as you stand there, you picture it vividly. A sharp blade catching the light, the tug at your scalp, the moment of lightness where your hair once was. The crowd might see it as symbolic purity, but you feel it as loss. Hair, after all, isn't just decoration, it carries memory. It carries the smell of smoke from your family's hearth, the warmth of sunlight from harvest fields, the traces of hands that braided it while you laughed with sisters or friends. To cut it feels like erasing the girl you were yesterday. You glance at the veil that hovers nearby, ready to fall across your face once this ritual ends. Soon, no one will see your hair at all. It will be hidden, covered, muted, as though your old self has been tucked away along with the strands already snipped. A chill trickles down your spine, colder than the stone beneath your feet. The congregation doesn't notice your unease. To them, this is ordinary, even touching a reminder of purity and transition. They smile faintly, perhaps thinking how symbolic it looks, how fitting it is for a bride to lose something in order to gain something greater. But to you, the loss feels heavier. You wonder, fleetingly, whether your mother cut a lock of her own hair on her wedding day, and whether she too felt this sharp pang of absence. The scent of incense curls through the air again, sweet and thick, and you close your eyes. The snipped strand is gone now, perhaps already gathered away by an attendant. You can't touch it, can't reclaim it. You feel exposed, vulnerable, as though the scissors cut not just hair but pieces of your identity. And then you open your eyes, staring at the candle flame trembling between your hands. For a moment, it almost looks like a reflection of your hair, golden, wavering, fragile. Perhaps the girl you were isn't gone entirely, perhaps she lingers, just dimmed, hidden beneath ritual. But the ache remains. Tonight, you are not only bound into a gown and vows, you are also shorn, reshaped, redefined, whether you wished it or not. The strand of hair may be gone, but the ritual isn't finished reshaping you. Now, a veil descends, soft and sheer, and suddenly the world blurs. You no longer see the congregation clearly. Their faces become vague shapes, their eyes dimmed behind gauze. What you do feel, however, is the unmistakable symbolism pressing in, your visibility muted, your voice hidden, your individuality smothered beneath fabric. One solid fact is that veils carried weighty meaning in the Middle Ages. They weren't just pretty accessories, they represented modesty, obedience, and often submission. The moment a veil covered a bride's head and face, she transformed in the eyes of society from maiden with some measure of freedom into wife bound to duty. It was a signal to everyone present that she now belonged to her husband's household. And here's a curious tidbit that makes the picture stranger still. In some regions, brides wore not delicate lace but heavy cloths that almost blinded them, forcing them to be led by hand down the aisle. Imagine stumbling forward, half blind, tripping over your gown while villagers whispered about how graceful or graceless you looked. What was supposed to signal virtue often left women feeling clumsy and disoriented. Yet the historical record doesn't speak with one clear voice on this. Some sources suggest veils were treasured, even desired tokens of honor, often embroidered or perfumed, a bride's proudest ornament. Other accounts paint them as oppressive, suffocating, enforced by elders to remind women of silence, which is closer to truth. The surviving evidence contradicts itself, and perhaps the experience depended entirely on who you were and where you stood. You, though, don't need a chronicle to tell you what it feels like. The fabric itches faintly against your cheeks. Your breath dampens the cloth until it sticks with each exhale. The candlelight turns into a haze, making you dizzy. Even sound changes, the priest's words muffled, the villagers' coughs muted, as though the world itself has placed you inside a soft cage. You grip the candle tighter because it is the only thing you can still see clearly, a small flame in a sea of blur. You wonder if your groom can see you at all. Does he see a woman beneath this veil, or only a symbol, a possession marked, covered, silenced? You can't read his face, not with fabric clouding your view. For all you know, his expression is relief, indifference, or even boredom. The veil cuts you off from that truth, and in the cutting, deepens your isolation. And yet, there is one fragile comfort buried in this ritual. Veils, in some places, were believed to guard against evil spirits, shielding brides from jealous eyes or curses cast during the ceremony. To wear one was to carry a barrier of protection, however flimsy. You think of it now, clinging to the faint hope that if someone mutters envy in the crowd, the fabric over your face might absorb the ill will. Still, as incense coils thicker and your own breath clouds the cloth, you can't deny the deeper symbolism pressing down. You are no longer meant to be seen fully, no longer meant to stand in clarity. What the congregation witnesses is a softened outline, a muted bride, a woman blurred into the role expected of her. The hymn swells again, muffled through the veil, and you close your eyes, momentarily surrendering to the dimness. When you open them, the world is still blurred, but the flame in your hands flickers steady. You cling to it, a reminder that though you may be hidden, somewhere beneath gauze and expectation, you still burn. The veil still clings to your face when you hear the shuffling outside the church doors. The time has come to leave the sacred space and step into the most public part of the day, the procession. You don't just walk quietly to your new home, you're paraded. Every villager, every gossip, every curious child lines the path to watch you march, a spectacle as much as a ceremony. It's a documented reality. Medieval weddings were not private affairs. They spilled into streets and churchyards, often resembling pageants. The bride was walked or sometimes even ridden on horseback through the village, her clothing, dowry, and demeanor scrutinized by all. The procession wasn't only about honor, it was surveillance, a reminder that the community itself had a stake in the union. You are suddenly not just a woman but a public performance. And then there are the odd little customs that add to the absurdity. In certain regions, villagers tossed wheat, barley, or even shoes at the bride as signs of fertility and luck. Shoes, of all things, imagine ducking under flying leather as you try not to stumble on cobblestones. Elsewhere, neighbors lit noisy firecrackers or banged pots to scare away evil spirits, creating a clamor that felt less like blessing and more like chaos. But if you comb through chronicles and folklore, the picture blurs. Some accounts describe processions as joyous, filled with music and laughter, neighbors dancing alongside the bride and groom. Others describe them as gauntlets of judgment, where brides endured snide comments, bawdy jokes, and even jeers. Was it celebration or humiliation? The surviving evidence pulls in both directions, leaving us to imagine it as a mixture cheerful to some, terrifying to others. You, standing in your heavy gown, know exactly which way it feels. The air outside is cold, the sky wide and grey, and yet sweat prickles down your spine as the eyes of the entire village bore into you. You hear laughter, low comments, the hiss of whispers carried by the wind. A child tugs at your skirt, nearly tripping you, and you stumble forward, heart racing. Immediately, you sense the ripple of judgment behind you. Someone snickers. Another mutters about clumsiness. The path stretches ahead, lined with neighbors craning their necks. You smell smoke from torches, hear the thin scrape of fiddles trying to play cheerful tunes. But underneath the music lies an edge of mockery. The procession is supposed to honor you, yet you feel like an animal led to market, paraded for eyes that do not blink. You glance at your husband, walking steady beside you, and wonder if he hears the same comments. Perhaps he doesn't. Perhaps he basks in the attention, proud to show off the alliance, the wealth, the bride now tethered to him. You, however, burn with the knowledge that every step is watched, every stumble recorded in the minds of villagers who will retell it for years. And yet, hidden in the dread, a flicker of connection stirs. Processions, even with their sting, also wove communities together. They gave neighbors a chance to witness, to bind themselves symbolically to the marriage. The grains thrown at your head, the clamor of pots and pans, however humiliating, were meant to knit you into the fabric of the village. For better or worse, you are no longer only your family's daughter, you are part of everyone's story now. Still, as the veil blurs your sight and the cold air stiffens your gown, you can't shake the truth that this procession is not a triumphal march, but a gauntlet. You walk with your head high, but your heart races, your candle flickering against the wind. Every step forward feels less like celebration and more like exposure. The jeers of the crowd may fade as you reach the end of the procession, but another, heavier silence waits for you. It's the silence that comes when the priest begins again, his voice carrying words that seem less about love and more about eternal surveillance. You know this isn't just a social contract, it's a divine one. You can feel every syllable pressed down like a judgment carved into stone. One solid fact is that in medieval theology, marriage wasn't simply practical, it was sacred. The Church taught that Christ himself blessed the union, and breaking vows was akin to breaking faith with God. Every stumble, every failure, every thought of rebellion carried the weight of sin. This wasn't a private arrangement between two people. It was a covenant sealed under heaven's eye. And yet, tucked into Chronicles, there are peculiar details. In some parishes, priests would dramatically warn couples that angels and saints were recording the ceremony, quills scratching in invisible ledgers. Some even pointed to carved figures in the church walls as if they were watching, eyes open wide to catch every misstep. Imagine repeating your vows while convinced that stone gargoyles and heavenly scribes leaned in to mark every word. Surviving texts don't all agree on how much fear was deliberately cultivated. Some sources suggest priests emphasized comfort, promising divine blessing and heavenly joy. Others describe ceremonies heavy with warnings. Disobey your spouse and you risk eternal damnation. The truth probably varied wildly, depending on the priest's temperament and the local culture. Was the bride comforted by God's presence, or crushed under the threat of it? The sources leave us straddling that uncertainty. You, however, feel the chill more than the comfort. The Latin chants echo through the vaulted space, their rhythms alien yet relentless. They fill the air like smoke, winding into your ears until you can't breathe without tasting the syllables. Every sound reinforces the reminder, you are being bound not only before your neighbors, but before heaven itself. Your stomach tightens as you imagine the weight of that invisible ledger. Every step you take tomorrow, every word you speak, every sigh you release, it all feels as though it will be judged, measured, counted against you. The candles flicker, and for a moment you're certain their flames lean in, too. Listening, you glance at your groom, steady and solemn, and wonder whether he feels the same. Does he fear eternal punishment if he falters? Or does he feel the reassurance of divine approval? His eyes don't waver, his shoulders don't slump. Perhaps he believes the angels smile on him. You, though, can't shake the sense that they're staring hardest at you. The air grows thick with incense again, and you cough softly behind your veil. The sound seems too loud, echoing like a mistake. You imagine villagers thinking, "Did you hear her cough during the vow? Did God notice?" The paranoia wraps tighter than any girdle, and yet, beneath the dread, a quiet thought flickers. If heaven watches so closely, perhaps heaven also hears silent prayers. Perhaps, in the long nights ahead, you can whisper your fears into the darkness, trusting that some corner of divinity listens not to punish but to comfort. It's a small ember of hope, faint but steady. Still, as the priest lifts his hand and intones the final blessing, you can't deny the fear that lingers, that God himself now watches your every step, and unlike villagers who gossip and move on, he never looks away. The priest's final blessing still hums in your ears when the church doors swing open to the next ordeal. The feast, the celebration, the banquet words that sound cheerful but in truth tighten your chest. You step into a hall alive with noise, the scent of roasted meat, the crackle of fire, the clatter of mugs against tables. This is supposed to be joy, yet for you it's another test. One undeniable fact is that medieval wedding banquets were rarely quiet affairs. They stretched for hours, sometimes even days, with endless courses of food, barrels of ale, and plenty of rowdy entertainment. Guests expected generosity, lavish platters, music, laughter, even the chance to snatch food to take home. To host poorly was to invite gossip, shame, and resentment. For the bride, it meant being scrutinized through every moment. Did she smile enough? Serve gracefully? Appear obedient? The feast was less a reward than a stage. And here's a curious tidbit tucked into accounts of the time. It was common for guests to sing bawdy, even crude songs during the banquet, teasing the couple about the wedding night to come. Imagine sitting stiffly at the high table, your cheeks burning, as drunken uncles belt out rhymes about what will happen behind closed doors. What modern ears might call harassment was then tradition, another way to remind the bride her body was no longer private. But sources don't paint a uniform picture. Some chronicles describe banquets as genuinely joyful, full of music and warmth, with brides remembered for their radiance. Others preserve hints of cruelty, mockery, drunken brawls, even fights over food or dowry disputes erupting in the middle of celebration. Which version was the truth? The records conflict, leaving us with a spectrum from delight to dread. You sit now at the head table, the veil heavy on your head, the gown still pressing at your ribs, and your stomach coils. The smell of spiced meat makes you nauseous, though you force a smile when servants lay platters before you. The hall is loud, too loud, laughter ringing harsh, mugs slamming, fiddles shrieking above the roar. Every time you lift a cup or taste a morsel, eyes follow, judging your gestures. You hear a song start at the far end of the hall. At first it sounds like a hymn, but soon the words twist into a crude jest. Verses about wedding beds and heirs. Laughter erupts. A mug crashes. Someone slaps the table, demanding another round of ale. You keep your head bowed, cheeks hot, trying to hide your discomfort. But the words find you anyway. They coil in your ears like taunts. Your husband laughs politely at one verse, but you don't know if it's from amusement or expectation. You grip your cup tighter, the cool rim grounding you, though your hands tremble. You feel as if your body has become public property, your privacy dissolved into the clamour of drunken voices. Still, if you look closely, you notice something else. Among the raucous guests, a few women meet your eyes with gentle nods. Perhaps they remember their own wedding nights, their own humiliation, and silently offer you a thread of solidarity. Their presence reminds you that not everyone in this hall watches with cruelty. Some watch with empathy, even pity. The feast stretches on. The air thickens with smoke, sweat, and spilled drink. Your head grows heavy from the noise, the smell, the unrelenting stares. You try to breathe through it, to let your gaze rest on the flicker of the hearth fire instead of the crowd. But the fear remains sharp, that tonight's banquet isn't a celebration of you, but a rehearsal for the gossip that will follow you into marriage. And as another crude song rises, you realize why so many brides trembled. Even joy could feel like a cage, and even laughter could sound like judgment. The laughter from the banquet still clings to your skin as the evening winds down. Guests are drunk, cheeks flushed, voices hoarse from song. The hall grows warmer, louder, messier, and yet through the noise you catch another sound: whispers. They curl toward you like smoke, sly, knowing, half mocking. You don't need to hear every word to understand their meaning. They're talking about the night ahead, the first night, the one everyone pretends is sacred but treats like theatre. It's a hard fact of the medieval world. The consummation of marriage was viewed as essential proof that the union was real. Without it, even vows and blessings could be challenged. Families, villages, even courts demanded evidence that the marriage bed had been used. A bride's fear wasn't only of intimacy with a stranger, but of the expectation that her body must perform like a public contract. And here's a peculiar tidbit that makes your stomach knot tighter. Some households staged crude rituals around this night. In certain places, guests followed the couple to the chamber door, cheering, singing bawdy songs, even waiting outside to celebrate once the deed was supposedly done. Imagine the humiliation. Not only was your privacy stripped, but your most vulnerable moment became community entertainment. But the historical record refuses to settle into one version. Some accounts paint consummation as quiet, private, with only discreet acknowledgement afterward. Others describe it as spectacle, sometimes even with physical proof displayed to silence gossip. Did brides step into shadow with a sense of fragile hope, or with the crushing knowledge of being watched, even through walls? The sources contradict each other, leaving the truth somewhere between terror and ritualized silence. You sit at the high table, trying to sip wine, trying to keep your face neutral, but every laugh, every wink, every elbow nudge aimed at your husband feels like a torch shining in your direction. The clamor makes your cheeks burn hotter than the fire at the hearth. You can feel the weight of expectation pressing down. Your stomach churns as you glance at him. He seems calm, perhaps resigned, perhaps indifferent. Does he notice your trembling hands? Does he hear the whispers too? You can't tell. His face reveals nothing. The air in the hall is heavy now, thick with ale and sweat. Your gown clings, your veil suffocates, and the thought of retreating to a room full of even greater expectation makes your knees weak. You imagine the silence of the chamber, broken only by whispers behind the door. You picture the sheets tomorrow, examined for proof like evidence at a trial. It's enough to make you want to vanish into the shadows. And yet, you notice something small. An older woman at the end of the hall catches your gaze. She offers a faint smile, weary but kind, as if to say she's walked this road before. For a fleeting moment, the fear eases. You aren't alone in this nightmare of whispers. Others endured, and some even survived with quiet dignity. Still, as another crude song rises and mugs crash against wood, you know why brides trembled most of all. It wasn't just the vows, or the priest, or the veil. It was the knowledge that tonight, your body becomes the final stage in a performance everyone else feels entitled to critique. And no matter how tightly you clutch the candle, no flame can burn away that shadow. The songs from the feast echo long after you've left the hall. Their crude verses trail behind you like thorns snagging your gown, reminders that the night is not over. Ahead waits something far heavier than laughter, the looming possibility of pregnancy. Even before you've stepped into the chamber, you know the truth. Every medieval bride carried in her bones marriage was not just about vows or property, it was about children. The historical record makes it plain. A bride's duty was tied above all to producing heirs. For noble families, this meant securing lineage and alliances. For peasants, it meant labourers to help in the fields. A barren bride was seen as a curse, whispered about in churchyards, blamed for misfortune. The pressure was relentless, and it settled over you like a shadow the moment vows were spoken. And then there's a disturbing little tidbit that circles in your mind. Some brides were given fertility charms hidden in their gowns, sprigs of rosemary, little cakes of bread, or even odd trinkets of bone. These were slipped quietly into skirts or shoes, talismans meant to ensure the womb would quicken. You can almost feel something scratch against your hem, as if someone tucked a charm there without your knowledge. It's meant as blessing, but it feels like intrusion. The scholars who study this period don't all tell the same story. Some argue that pregnancy was celebrated with genuine joy, that women were supported by neighbors and kin when children came. Others emphasize the darker side, fear of miscarriage, shame of barrenness, and the deadly reality that childbirth itself often carried women to the grave. Which vision dominates depends on the fragment of history you choose to believe. Both cling to you now. The hope of joy, the dread of death. You picture it vividly. The first missed cycle, the swelling belly, the whispers in the village, "She's blessed," or "She's cursed." You imagine lying in childbed months later, sweat dripping, breath ragged, the midwife's face grim. You hear the cries of other women who didn't survive, their stories traded like warnings. The weight of that knowledge makes the chamber door ahead look more like a coffin lid than a threshold. Your stomach knots, not only from fear of the act itself, but from what might follow 9 months later. You remember tales of neighbors who died bringing life into the world, their names whispered only in sorrow. A chill prickles along your spine. This marriage isn't just binding you to a man, it binds you to the possibility of death with every child you bear. And yet, in some corner of your heart, you recognize the other side. For some women, pregnancy was the only source of power. They could claim the ability to shape lineage, to wield influence as mothers of heirs. You cling briefly to that thought, though it feels frail compared to the danger. The candle in your hand flickers as though it knows your thoughts. Its flame wavers, weak but unbroken. You stare into it, hoping that if it can survive the drafts of this stone hall, perhaps you can survive what lies ahead. But the truth presses in regardless. This night isn't just about proving virginity or obeying vows. It's about carrying the weight of future lives inside you, lives that may cost your own. And as you take another step forward, you understand why brides trembled not only for the ceremony, not only for the whispers, but for the long shadow of childbirth waiting beyond the chamber door. The thought of childbirth haunts you still when another figure steps into your mind's eye, your husband's mother. You haven't even reached his household yet, and already you can feel the weight of her presence pressing at your shoulders. In this world, you aren't just marrying a man, you're marrying into his family, and at the very heart of it stands the mother-in-law. A hard fact of medieval life is that households often revolved around the authority of the matriarch. Even if your husband carried legal power, it was his mother who ruled the kitchens, the servants, the rhythms of daily life. She knew where the grain was stored, which servants were loyal, which relatives owed debts. To step into her house was to step into her domain, and you were an intruder. And then there's a strange little tidbit that feels almost like a cruel joke. In some households, the mother-in-law was given the right to inspect the bride's chest of dowry items upon arrival, rooting through linens, pots, even undergarments, as though testing the bride's worthiness. Imagine standing silently while your private belongings are poured at, every item judged against invisible standards. The humiliation of it could sting worse than any gossip. The sources don't agree on how universal this dynamic was. Some accounts suggest mothers-in-law could be fiercely protective, guiding new brides with patience, almost like second mothers. Others tell stories of cruelty control, jealousy, and relentless judgment. Did brides find allies in these stern figures, or did they face daily battles under their eyes? The records split, leaving us with fragments of both comfort and dread. You, standing in the candlelit hall, can already picture it. The older woman waiting at the door, arms crossed, eyes sharp as flint, her voice clipped, asking questions you can't answer quickly enough. Her gaze lingering too long on your gown, your chest of linen, your trembling hands. Will she ever see you as daughter, or only as outsider, intruder, threat? The uncertainty claws at you. The thought makes your skin prickle. You imagine waking tomorrow in her house, every movement watched, how you stir a pot, how you sew a seam, how you bow your head. You can almost hear her voice correcting you, sharp, impatient. In her eyes, you are not bride or partner. You are competition for authority, someone to be shaped or crushed. And yet, you remind yourself that sometimes power bends strangely. A bride who wins favor might inherit some of that authority, becoming trusted in household affairs. The thought is faint, but it flickers. Perhaps you might turn her scrutiny into a shield rather than a weapon. If she sees you as capable, she might one day hand you the keys to the pantry instead of guarding them against you. Still, as you breathe in the thick scent of incense and wine, the image of her face will not leave you. It hovers at the edge of your imagination like a sentinel. You sense that even if demons and spirits were banished from the church, another form of dread waits at the hearth. And this one wears no shadow, no wings, only the stern expression of a woman who knows her power. You clutch the candle tighter. Its wax drips hot onto your fingers, grounding you in the moment. You know already why brides trembled. Not only because of husbands, not only because of priests, but because they stepped into houses where a mother-in-law's eyes could pierce sharper than any sword. The image of your stern mother-in-law lingers when you recall another truth even heavier. Once you crossed the threshold into marriage, the law itself no longer saw you as independent. You were folded into your husband's identity, erased like chalk under water. It's a firm fact. Under medieval legal systems across much of Europe, a married woman's rights were drastically curtailed. The concept of coverture meant her property, earnings, and even her body were effectively under her husband's control. She could not sue in her own name, could not inherit freely without conditions, and often could not sign contracts without his approval. Your very self was considered subsumed. You are not just leaving home, you are vanishing into someone else's shadow. And then there's an odd tidbit that sharpens the sting. In certain towns, charters required that a married woman's name be recorded not as her own, but only as the wife of, followed by her husband's name. Imagine reading a ledger centuries later and seeing yourself erased, reduced to a possessive phrase. Even in written memory, you cease to exist. Yet scholars examining these records don't present a perfectly tidy picture. Some argue that in practice, women still wielded quiet authority running shops, managing estates, and influencing family decisions behind the curtain of law. Others emphasize the harsh limits, insisting that even wealthy or clever women were boxed in by statutes and custom. The tension between official rules and lived reality makes the truth hazy, shifting depending on whose story you follow. But you, standing in your heavy gown, feel only the narrowing of space around you. The villagers may cheer, the priest may bless, but you sense the invisible chains settling. You think of the chest of linen you carried, the dowry coins, the animals pledged in your name, all of it now slipping into another man's possession. What was once yours, what once bore the scent of your mother's hands or the calluses of your father's labor, is no longer connected to you at all. You imagine tomorrow, when your name is spoken, no longer will they call you by the familiar nickname of your childhood. You'll be addressed by your husband's name, perhaps even mocked if you dare claim something as your own. The thought feels like another strand of hair being cut away, another veil pulled over your face. The candle flame trembles in your hand. For a heartbeat, you wonder whether this extinguishing of identity is worse than the vows themselves. At least the vows were spoken aloud, witnessed, tangible. The law's erasure is quieter, subtler, but more permanent. You are here, alive, breathing, trembling, but in the eyes of parchment and seal, you have already disappeared. And yet, some ember of resistance stirs. You think of women whispered about in taverns, those who managed to bend the rules, who traded cleverly, who slipped coins aside, who advised their husbands in matters of land and law. Perhaps not every bride was wholly erased. Perhaps some left fingerprints, faint but undeniable, even if scribes refused to record their names. That fragile thought is the only comfort you carry. Still, the truth bears down heavier than the gown or veil. Tonight you are not just a bride. You are a possession, transferred, renamed, rewritten until even history itself may forget who you once were. The knowledge of your own erasure sinks deep, yet another fear rises to fill the silence, the whispers of shame that hover around every married woman. In this world, reputation clings like a second skin, and once stained, it rarely washes clean. You sense it already in the way the villagers' eyes track you, waiting for any stumble, any misstep they can turn into gossip. One fact historians note again and again is how brutally reputation shaped a bride's life. A woman who failed to conceive was labeled barren, her worth questioned, even if the problem lay with her husband. A woman who bore only daughters might be pitied or mocked. A wife who was too outspoken, too visible, too clumsy risked becoming the subject of endless chatter. Honor was fragile, and the shame of one rumor could echo longer than the sound of church bells. And here's a curious little tidbit tucked into chronicles. In some villages, barren women were given mocking nicknames, cruel rhymes sung by children in the street. Imagine stepping out to fetch water and hearing young voices chant about your womb as though it were a broken tool. The cruelty is almost unbearable to picture, but it reminds you how public a bride's private life could become. The records don't line up neatly, though. Some accounts insist that communities were kinder, offering sympathy and herbal remedies when women failed to conceive. Others describe relentless judgment, where neighbors treated childlessness as a curse or punishment from God. Did brides find compassion in misfortune, or did they endure ridicule? The surviving fragments tug in opposite directions, leaving the truth blurred. You, however, can almost hear it already. Tomorrow, if you trip carrying water, someone will mutter that it's an omen. If a month passes without quickening, whispers will coil through the streets. Maybe she isn't pure. Maybe God disapproves. You picture faces leaning together in churchyards, hands cupped to mouths, eyes darting toward you. The heat rises in your cheeks. Though nothing has yet happened, the anticipation of shame is enough. Your candle trembles in your hand, its wax dripping down onto your knuckles. You imagine that drip becoming a rumor, spreading, burning, impossible to contain. You remember the laughter at the banquet, the bawdy songs, and you realize those were only the beginning. The world doesn't stop watching you after vows are spoken. It sharpens its gaze, waiting for cracks. And yet, tucked beneath the dread, a tiny ember of defiance glows. Some women manage to twist gossip to their advantage, turning whispers into stories of strength, laughing louder than their mockers, or earning respect through skill in fields, markets, or kitchens. Perhaps shame wasn't always a death sentence. Perhaps it could sometimes be redirected, reshaped. Still, the fear lingers sharper than the incense in your lungs. You are no longer just yourself, you are a mirror, a reflection, a vessel for other people's expectations. Every stumble, every barren season, every unlucky omen could brand you in ways you'll never erase. That knowledge alone makes your hands shake harder than the vows, the veil, or the weight of the gown. Because this fear isn't confined to one night. It's a shadow that will follow you into every year of marriage. The threat of gossip feels heavy enough, but it deepens when you remember another shadow that hung over every medieval household: plague, famine, sudden death. You stand here in candlelight, but the knowledge never leaves your bones. Life is fragile, brittle, and often brutally short. A wedding might be followed not by decades of shared life, but by a funeral within weeks. The evidence is unrelenting. Records show that mortality rates in the Middle Ages were staggering. Plague swept through villages, fevers burned through families, childbirth ended countless lives. A wedding wasn't a guarantee of a future, it was more like a fragile hope in a world where death always sat at the table. You knew, as a bride, that your husband could be gone by winter, or that you yourself might not survive the first birth. And there's a haunting little tidbit that lingers in folk traditions. In some regions, brides carried sprigs of rue or rosemary in their bouquets, not only for fertility, but also as protection against disease. Imagine clutching herbs scented sharp and bitter, meant to ward off invisible killers, even as you smiled for the crowd. The fragrance of death and medicine became stitched into the very fabric of a wedding day. Yet, the way people interpreted this looming shadow still divides historians. Some argue that constant familiarity with death made people more resilient, more pragmatic, almost numb to it. Others insist it heightened their fear, filling every ritual with urgency and superstition. Did brides accept mortality calmly, or did they quake beneath the knowledge that joy could sour into mourning overnight? The surviving voices pull in both directions, refusing to settle. You, though, feel it keenly. As the priest's Latin still hums in the back of your mind, you imagine the toll of a bell not for celebration but for burial. You picture neighbors carrying candles in procession, but this time for a coffin. The line between a bridal march and a funeral cortege feels terrifyingly thin. The hall smells of wax and incense, but beneath it you imagine the acrid tang of sickness, the sour stench of sweat from fevered bodies. You remember stories whispered by your mother of brides, who barely lived long enough to christen their first child, their veils reused as shrouds. The thought presses like ice against your chest. Your candle wavers again, a fragile flame against a draught. It looks too much like life itself, bright one moment, guttering the next. You tighten your grip, as though by holding steady you might keep it alive. And yet, tucked into this fear, a strange kind of strength rises. If life is so fragile, perhaps every moment carries more weight. Perhaps that's why people feasted so loudly, sang so crudely, prayed so fervently, because they knew the feast might end suddenly. The fragility of life sharpened both fear and joy. Still, as you stand in the flickering light, the knowledge does not comfort you, it terrifies you. Because you know that your vows were not promises of a long life together, they were promises to endure whatever came, even if whatever came was death knocking before the sheets cooled from your wedding night. The thought of plague and death still clings to you when another fear slides in, one sharpened if you happen to be born into nobility. For a peasant girl, marriage was about land and labor, but for a noble bride, it was politics. You weren't simply marrying a man, you were often a pawn in a treaty, a fragile link in the chains of diplomacy. The record is full of examples. Noble daughters were promised across borders, betrothed at ages when they still played with toys, handed over to secure peace between warring houses. A bride's smile was supposed to mean harmony between nations, even though her heart beat fast with terror. You can almost feel it now, the sense that your body isn't just your family's property, but a symbol carved onto a map. And here's a striking tidbit buried in Chronicles. Some brides were literally handed over at borders, processions meeting halfway between territories. The young woman transferred like cargo while soldiers stood watching. Imagine crossing a river or walking under a stone arch, leaving your language, your food, your childhood behind, and stepping into a world where everything is foreign, even your husband's words. The sources don't always agree on how these noble brides felt or fared. Some letters hint at pride, at women who embraced their role and wielded influence at court. Others hint at despair, loneliness, homesickness, fear of strangers in strange lands. Which is closer to the truth? The evidence contradicts itself, as though even history can't decide whether these women were queens in training or pawns abandoned on the board. You picture it in your mind. Soldiers flanking a road, banners whipping in the wind, villagers watching silently as you step down from one carriage and into another. You hold your chest of linen tightly, though you know it hardly matters. You're leaving behind not just a house, not just a family, but an entire country that once shaped your tongue and your prayers. The crowd in the church tonight feels smaller in comparison, but the fear is the same. You know that somewhere, even now, other brides are being bartered across mountains and seas, their fates sealed with wax and signatures. Their trembling hands are just like yours, clutching candles, clinging to fragments of home. You breathe in the incense, sharp and heavy, and it makes your stomach turn. The veil itches against your cheeks, the gown pinches at your ribs, and you think of all the noble women who endured worse marriages meant to cool wars. Marriages that collapsed into bloodshed anyway. You wonder if your vows tonight might someday be invoked in disputes, your womb argued about at council tables. The thought makes your candle flame waver. And yet, somewhere in this terror hides another truth. Some brides rose above the role of pawn. Some became queens whose words shifted policy, whose children redefined dynasties, whose names still echo in stone. That doesn't erase the fear, but it hints that even pawns sometimes became powerful players. Still, standing here tonight, you don't feel like a queen in waiting. You feel like a fragile offering, trembling beneath the weight of banners you cannot carry. That too is why brides shook with fear, because they knew that in a world of politics and power, their very bodies could become battlefields. The image of banners at borders fades, but the weight of authority lingers, turning your thoughts toward the most terrifying punishment of all, spiritual damnation. For a medieval bride, failure in marriage was not just a social embarrassment, it could be cast as a sin against heaven itself. You feel that fear coil tighter in your chest as the priest's words echo in memory, warning of vows that bind your soul as much as your body. A clear fact runs through church records. Annulments were rare, excommunication was possible, and both carried devastating consequences. To break a marriage vow, or to be accused of adultery, was to risk being cut off from the sacraments. In a world where salvation was everything, that meant eternal separation from God. Imagine trembling not only at your husband's temper or your village's gossip, but at the threat of eternal fire hanging over your every choice. And then there's an eerie little tidbit that surfaces in Chronicles. Some women accused of marital failure were forced to do public penance, paraded barefoot through the streets, clothed only in shifts, ashes on their heads, while villagers hurled insults. It wasn't just your marriage on trial, it was your very soul, humiliated before heaven and earth alike. The sources don't settle into one neat story, though. Some documents emphasize that church courts could be surprisingly sympathetic, especially toward women abandoned by husbands. Others reveal brutal severity, where priests thundered condemnations and punishments fell hardest on brides. Was the church a protector or a tormentor? The evidence diverges, leaving us in the uneasy space between mercy and menace. You picture yourself caught in that limbo, the church bells tolling not for blessing but for judgment. The congregation gathered not in joy but in condemnation. You can almost hear the whispers. She failed. She sinned. She is lost. The veil on your face feels suddenly heavier, as though woven from ash instead of silk. Your heart races with the knowledge that this vow you spoke tonight isn't like a promise between friends, broken and forgiven with time. This vow, they say, echoes into eternity. To falter is to risk damnation itself. And while your husband might sin freely, forgiven with confession, you know the same mercy may not be offered so easily to you. The imbalance gnaws bitterly. You stare at the candle in your hand. Its flame trembles, but at least it burns clean. You wonder if your own soul will stay as pure, or if it will one day be judged smoke-stained and wavering. The fear presses deeper than gossip or dowry disputes. This is fear of heaven's silence, of being cut away from grace. And yet, in the quiet recess of your heart, you cling to another thought. Not every priest thundered, not every parish punished. Somewhere, women whispered their confessions and found gentleness instead of fire. Perhaps, you tell yourself, heaven listens more kindly than men pretend. The idea steadies you faintly, like a hand on your shoulder in the dark. Still, the truth remains. Brides trembled not only from earthly burdens but from the shadow of eternal judgment. For you, standing in this church, the vows feel less like promises of love, and more like chains tying your soul to a fate you cannot escape. The fear of judgment still lingers in your chest when another detail tugs at your awareness, one not of punishment, but of strange attempts at protection. Tonight, you remember the little objects tucked into your gown, the charms whispered about in kitchens and spun into folk songs. Fertility, safety, luck, all supposedly wrapped in herbs, bread, salt, and tokens, slipped into secret folds of fabric. It's a fact well attested in folklore and household records. Medieval brides often carried charms on their wedding day. A pinch of salt hidden in a pocket to ward off envy, a sprig of rosemary for fertility, a small loaf of bread baked with prayers and crumbled beneath the bed to ensure prosperity. These weren't sanctioned by the church, yet they thrived in the spaces where faith and superstition intertwined. And then there's a delightful, slightly comical tidbit. In some places, friends sewed whole garlands of herbs and even garlic into a bride's hem, so she entered her new home smelling faintly like a garden or a stew pot. Imagine the solemnity of vows paired with the sharp tang of garlic and sage wafting down the aisle. What we might laugh at today was, for them, deadly serious protection. But as usual, the picture isn't consistent. Some sources suggest these charms were common, embraced even by families of means. Others insist they were frowned upon, tolerated only in rustic villages, half hidden from the disapproving eyes of priests. Were they universal or merely regional quirks? The evidence scatters, leaving historians with more questions than answers. You, however, feel the weight of them even now. Something presses lightly against your hip, maybe the sprig your mother slipped into your skirts before you left. You recall the smell of her kitchen, the hush in her voice as she told you it would keep you safe, keep you fertile, keep the envy away. The memory stings, sweet and sorrowful, because it reminds you of her hands, steady and certain, when yours tremble. The air in the hall smells of incense, wine, and sweat, but beneath it, you catch the faint sharpness of herbs. You wonder if the scent is yours or another bride's before you, lingering in the stones, layer upon layer of charms burned into memory. You grip the candle tighter, almost as if its flame joins those old protections, glowing against unseen threats. And yet, the veil of doubt presses close. Do these charms actually protect, or are they just fragile illusions to make frightened women feel less alone? Did brides truly believe, or did they cling because there was nothing else to hold? The truth shifts like smoke, impossible to pin down. Still, the thought of your mother's hands slipping that sprig into your gown steadies you. Whether it carries magic or not, it carries love, and perhaps that is its own kind of shield. You draw a deeper breath, the herb scent mingling with candle wax, and tell yourself that maybe, just maybe, you are not entirely defenseless after all. The faint smell of herbs steadies you for a moment, but then another kind of shadow creeps in, a fear, not of spirits or charms, but of betrayal. You know well enough that in this world, infidelity is a dangerous game, and it's women who pay the highest price. Even if you never stray, the mere suspicion could mark you for life. The legal and social records make it stark. Adultery carried punishments that fell far harder on wives than on husbands. A man's unfaithfulness might be whispered about, shrugged off, even joked over in the tavern. A woman's, though, could lead to annulment, disgrace, sometimes even physical punishment. A bride carried not just vows but an invisible sentence: remain spotless or risk ruin. And here's a sharp, unsettling tidbit. In some towns, suspected adulteresses were forced to parade publicly, heads shaved, clothes torn, mocked by neighbors, while bells rang overhead. The act was meant as humiliation more than justice, a spectacle of shame. Imagine walking past the very same villagers who once tossed wheat at your wedding, now jeering as if you had poisoned their wells. Surviving sources do not all agree on how common such extremes were. Some suggest they were rare, reserved for scandalous cases that threatened the fabric of community order. Others argue they happened often enough to keep every wife trembling. Did women truly live under daily threat, or only under the shadow of rare but terrifying examples? The record doesn't offer a single answer, leaving only unease. But you don't need statistics to feel the chill. You imagine it too easily: the glares, the whispers, the shaved head catching cold wind, the shame you could never shake. You feel it in your bones that the world would forgive your husband 1,000 times before sparing you once. Even now, as you hold the candle steady, you know that any stumble, any rumor, could one day spiral into judgment. The hall around you buzzes with merriment, but beneath the laughter you hear another kind of murmur. A guest jokes crudely about heirs and mistresses, earning laughter, yet you feel no one would laugh if the joke had been turned on you. The double standard scratches sharp against your chest. And yet, even in this fear, a tiny ember of possibility exists. Some women did defy the rule: queens who loved boldly, wives who held secrets close, women whose affairs became legend rather than condemnation. Were they exceptions, or did they simply slip through the cracks of record-keeping? Their existence flickers faintly, reminding you that no system, however cruel, is absolute. Still, as you breathe in the thick air of wine and smoke, you feel the imbalance pressing heavy. For you, the candle flame is not just a light, it's a warning. Step carefully, remain flawless, or risk being burned by whispers that never die. That's why your hands tremble more fiercely than ever. Because in this world, fear doesn't end with vows. It lingers in the suspicion of every watchful eye. The fear of shame for adultery lingers, but now another ritual makes your stomach clench. This one isn't whispered or private, it's brazenly public. In some places, the consummation of marriage wasn't left to the quiet of a chamber. Instead, it became performance, a community matter, an intrusion so stark it still makes your skin prickle centuries later. It's a fact preserved in scattered accounts. In parts of medieval Europe, villagers gathered outside the bridal chamber, singing, shouting, sometimes even pushing the couple inside. The act of closing the door was met with cheers. In extreme cases, proof of consummation was demanded: bed linens displayed to family or neighbors as evidence. It wasn't merely gossip. It was ritualized surveillance. And here's a bizarre little tidbit that turns the stomach further. In a few regions, the bridal bed itself was displayed in daylight before the wedding, decorated with herbs, ribbons, and food offerings, as though everyone had the right to examine the site of intimacy. The same bed, hours later, would host the most private act of your life. Imagine sitting at the feast, glancing at that very bed in the corner, its sheets already inspected by curious eyes. But records don't speak in one clear voice. Some scholars argue these public rituals were rare, exaggerated by satirists who mocked rural customs. Others insist they were widespread enough to terrify every bride, woven into local traditions as a way of binding community and couple together. Was it spectacle or rumor? The evidence pulls in opposite directions, leaving us in uneasy uncertainty. You, though, don't need parchment to feel the horror. You picture the moment, a crowd pressing close, laughter too loud, songs too crude, every eye turned toward the door you're expected to walk through. The candle in your hand shakes violently as you imagine whispers slipping under the wood, your name muttered alongside jokes. The hall smells of smoke and spilled ale, but under it lies a sharper scent, sweat, tension, the heat of too many bodies leaning too close. You try to keep your face composed, but your cheeks burn, your heart drums against your ribs. The very thought of being watched, measured, turned into spectacle, makes your legs weak. You glance sideways at your husband, but his face is unreadable. Does he find comfort in this ritual, or does he resent it too? You cannot know. You only know that your own body feels like property being inspected, as if you were a field whose soil must be proven fertile in front of witnesses. And yet, you cling to a sliver of defiance. Even if the crowd howls, even if sheets are examined, there remains a truth no ritual can erase. The reality of what happens behind closed doors belongs to you, if only in memory. Whether it's pain, fear, or a flicker of tenderness, no one can take the private sensations from within your skin. That thought is fragile, but it's yours. Still, the fear won't leave. You know why brides trembled, why hands quivered around candles. Because for them, the most intimate moment wasn't safe from public eyes. Privacy itself was a luxury you couldn't count on, not even in the bed you now dread to enter. The imagined bed still looms in your thoughts when another sound intrudes a tune. Softer now, but no less haunting. You hear songs drifting from the corners of memory, verses carried by older women as they worked at looms or drew water from wells. They were not cheerful ballads. They were songs of brides who wept, of daughters who left home, of women who feared what awaited them. One thing the historical record shows is that music wove through medieval life as much as prayer did. Weddings weren't only marked by bells and chants, they were marked by songs, some joyful, some mournful. In certain regions, women sang laments as brides left their villages, voices carrying sorrow like a warning. These weren't hidden songs. They were part of the ritual, reminders that marriage meant loss as much as gain. And here's a curious little tidbit. A few of these laments were deliberately exaggerated, almost theatrical. Singers wailed loudly enough to make neighbors laugh or cry, turning the bride's departure into both spectacle and tragedy. Imagine sitting in a cart or on a horse while women shrieked verses about your tears, your fear, your vanished childhood. Was it comfort or cruelty disguised as tradition? The surviving evidence doesn't settle into one neat meaning. Some scholars suggest the laments were meant as catharsis, giving women a way to express grief openly before silence closed in. Others think they were warnings, teaching brides obedience by reminding them of others' suffering. Were they songs of solidarity or cautionary tales wrapped in melody? The truth drifts like the music itself, unpinned. But you can hear it now, can't you? A thin voice rising above the banquet noise, verses you half remember, a bride leaving her mother's hearth, a girl weeping as she crosses into her husband's hall. The notes echo through your ribs, slow and sorrowful. Your skin prickles as if those voices sing for you. The candle flame wavers as the tune coils around you. It's almost mocking, reminding you that your fear is not new, that countless others have walked this same path with the same tremor in their hands. You are not unique. You are one more verse in an old, sad song. You glance at the faces around you, but no one else seems disturbed. Perhaps they're too drunk, too cheerful, to notice the weight of the melody. But you notice. You feel it press into your bones. The laughter at the tables clashes painfully with the phantom laments in your ears, like joy and grief layered badly on top of each other. And yet, maybe there's a strange comfort hidden in those verses. If women sang their fear, it means they were not entirely silent. Even when their lives were bound by vows and scrutiny, they found a way to leave a trace, a melody that still hums in the air centuries later. That thought softens your fear, if only for a moment. Still, As the last note fades, you realize why the songs frightened brides as much as they consoled them. They reminded you that your trembling hands weren't yours alone. They were part of an endless chorus of women who feared the same night, the same vows, the same fate. The echoes of sorrowful songs still linger in your ears, but now your thoughts drift toward the question that lies beneath all of this. How much of this fear was universal, and how much is colored by the fragments we've inherited? When you step back from the dim church, the smoke, the veils, the chants, you find yourself asking, was every medieval wedding truly soaked in dread, or is that only part of the story? The surviving records do not sing in harmony. Some charters, poems, and letters describe weddings as joyous occasions, filled with laughter, dancing, gifts, and genuine affection. Others lean into the imagery of trembling brides, frightened vows, and sorrowful laments. The sources contradict each other, pulling us in opposite directions. It's as though history itself can't decide whether the wedding day was celebration or crucible. And here's a curious little tidbit. In some folklore, people claimed brides who cried during the ceremony were actually bringing good luck, ensuring fertile marriages. Tears, in that telling, weren't weakness at all, but blessings in disguise. Imagine the irony that the very shaking and sobbing we now see as terror might once have been spun as charm against misfortune. Modern scholars puzzle over these contradictions. Some argue that chroniclers, often male clerics, were biased, eager to present women as fearful, obedient, fragile. Others suggest that the laments, the superstitions, the heavy garments all point to real dread felt by brides who knew exactly what they were walking into. Were brides truly terrified? Or have centuries of selective memory exaggerated their trembling? The debate lingers, unresolved. But you, standing in this imagined moment, don't feel like a footnote in an academic quarrel. You feel the weight of the veil on your face, the cord tight around your ribs, the heat of all those eyes pressing on your back. Whether history paints it accurately or not, you know the sensation of fear is real because it lives in your body right now. The candle quivers between your fingers. You try to picture the stories that argue against this dread: brides smiling, brides laughing, brides dancing into halls where they were welcomed with warmth instead of scrutiny. Maybe they existed. Maybe they were more common than the fearful tales suggest. But those are not the stories that cling most tightly to memory. Fear, after all, leaves a sharper mark than joy. And so you walk the thin line between history and legend, caught in the middle of competing voices. The songs of sorrow tell you one truth, the chronicles another, the scholars a third. None erase the tremor in your hand, the blur of tears behind your veil. In the end, what matters isn't whether all brides trembled. What matters is that enough did, and that their fear was remembered, sung, whispered, debated, carried forward like the flicker of a candle through the dark. The scholarly quarrels fade, and you are left once more with the simple weight of your own body, standing where countless women once stood. The more you think, the more you sense echoes pressing in from every side, as if the stone walls of the church remember every trembling bride who walked here before you. You are not just one frightened woman. You are part of a chorus stretching back centuries. The records make it clear, marriage was a constant in medieval life. Whether you were a peasant girl carrying onions in your dowry, or a princess riding into a foreign kingdom, the ritual was unavoidable. Brides everywhere felt the same combination of duty, fear, and hope. Some resisted, some submitted, some thrived, and some broke. Their voices may be faint now, but they are not gone. And here's a small, haunting tidbit. In certain villages, brides carved initials or tiny crosses into church pews before the ceremony, scratching the wood as though to leave a mark of their true selves behind. Many of these carvings survive, worn smooth by centuries of hands, little ghost signatures whispering, "I was here. I lived this day too." Imagine touching such a mark with your fingers, feeling a pulse of fear and kinship across time. The fragments left behind don't always agree on the tone of those weddings. Some chronicles dwell on joy, on banquets and dances. Others tell stories of sobbing brides and uneasy silences. The truth is layered, complex, slippery. But what shines through them all is repetition, the ritual repeated again and again, and with it, the same tremors of hands clutching candles, the same gasps beneath veils, the same whispered prayers. You feel that continuity now. The draft of the church brushes your cheek, and for a moment it feels like the breath of every bride before you. Their fear mingles with yours, a collective memory pressing down heavier than any gown or veil. You realize that this trembling you feel isn't only your own, it's a memory that belongs to generations. The candle flame flickers, casting shifting shapes on the stone wall. You imagine the shadows as brides themselves, standing beside you in silent solidarity. Some weep, some stand defiant, some clutch their hands tightly together. They remind you that you aren't alone, not even across centuries. And yet, there's a strange sorrow in that realization too. To know so many women carried this fear means it wasn't accident, it was system. The trembling wasn't just individual nerves, but the product of a world that made brides afraid by design. Still, as your fingers tighten around the wax, you sense their presence as comfort as well. They endured, and somehow so will you. Their echoes hum through the walls, through the hymns, through the smoke of incense. You walk the same path, trembling like they did, and in that trembling you are bound together. The echoes of trembling brides cling to you still, and yet now the night reaches its final stretch. The candles burn lower, the songs fade, and all that remains is you, your hands shaking around the taper, your breath shallow beneath the veil. The rituals have stripped you piece by piece. The bargaining, the dowry, the vows, the veil, the songs, the scrutiny. What is left is a girl holding on to a fragile flame, her knuckles white against dripping wax. The historical record tells us again and again that marriage was designed as a binding of property, of families, of souls. It was never only about the two people at the altar. It was about everyone watching, everyone gossiping, everyone claiming a stake. That's why brides feared not just the man they married, but the weight of the entire world pressing down at once. And here's one last, quiet tidbit that feels almost too poetic to be true. In some places, brides carried small candles into the chamber, believing the flame symbolized their own life, and that if it went out before morning, misfortune would follow. Imagine lying in the dark, your nerves frayed, while beside the bed a candle guttered and flared, each flicker tightening your chest. Even the fire seemed part of the test. As with so much, accounts diverge. Some say brides embraced these rituals, trusting them, weaving hope into fear. Others suggest women endured them resentfully, trembling until exhaustion dulled their panic. Which was more common, joy or dread? The truth, as always, slips between the lines. But in your body, the answer is clear. Your fingers ache from holding the taper. Your arms are stiff, your breath still uneven. The wax burns your skin, yet you refuse to let go. Because to let go would be to surrender, and you have already surrendered enough. The hall grows quieter, the last drunken voices trailing into snores. You hear only the faint hiss of the flame and the blood in your ears. You stare at the trembling light, and for a moment you wonder whether it is trembling for you or with you. You think of every bride before you and every bride after you, and you realize this is why the fear lingers, not because you are weak, but because the system itself demanded your fear. It built it into vows, into gowns, into veils and songs and whispers. It crafted trembling hands as part of the ritual. Still, in this final moment, you stand with the candle steady, even as the wax drips onto your skin. Perhaps that is the quietest act of defiance. To tremble, yes, but to hold on anyway. And now, as the last section closes, let the story slow, the voice soften, the edges blur. You're no longer standing in the stone nave, no longer crushed by the weight of fabric or vows. You are here, in your own quiet room, listening as the echoes of centuries fade into whispers. The candle you imagined still flickers gently, but it no longer burns your skin. It becomes a small comfort, a light against the dark, steady and calm. You can let your shoulders ease. The breath you held can slip free, The faces of villagers, priests, and stern mothers-in-law melt away into shadows, leaving only silence and warmth. The heavy gown dissolves, the veil lifts, and you find yourself lighter, as though the centuries of trembling brides have laid their burden down at last. The fear we walk through tonight doesn't need to follow you into sleep. Instead, it can rest in history, where it belongs. What you carry forward is not the dread, but the quiet resilience that lived beneath it. Those trembling hands still held candles steady. Those voices, even when silenced, left marks in songs and carvings and memories. And you, listening now, are part of that thread of remembrance. So let the last flicker of the flame soften into a glow that warms rather than blinds. Let your eyelids grow heavier, your breath slower, your mind quieter. The story has ended, and all that remains is calm. The candle burns steady, the night grows still, and your body can finally rest. Sleep, knowing the past has spoken, and tomorrow waits gentle, unhurried, free of fear. Sweet dreams.